Hello and welcome to the Global Hemophilia Report, a podcast at the intersection of science, storytelling, and curiosity. Produced by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media in partnership with Senior Scientific Advisor Dr. Donna DiMichele, and made possible thanks to our featured advertiser, Sanofi. I'm your host and resident person with hemophilia, Patrick James Lynch, and I thank you very much for joining us. What's actually happening out there? With all the innovation and research taking place across not just hemophilia, but across all of the larger bleeding disorders spectrum, it can be difficult to keep up to date. Moreover, if you, like me, are not a researcher or a data scientist, trying to digest extensive research publications and nuanced scientific reports can feel just plain impossible. One of the recurring themes of our Global Hemophilia Report episodes of late, all of which can be found at globalhemophiliareport.com, by the way, has been the critical importance of patient inclusion or lived experienced expert inclusion throughout the drug discovery and research process. As a lived experienced expert, as a patient speaking from my own experience, I'll just say that research can feel intimidating. It can feel inaccessible, as though it's not for me, especially when I don't feel connected to the results of participation. One of the many valuable components of the annual Bleeding Disorders Conference from the National Blood Disorders Foundation, that's not the name of the organization, let's do that again. One of the many valuable components of the Bleeding Disorders Conference from the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation is the poster walls or poster walk portion of the exhibit hall, where dozens of studies and research data are presented for the benefit of patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders at the meeting. At the 2025 meeting, I had the unique privilege of walking through the poster wall exhibit with three of the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation's most important figures with respect to scientific research and innovation. You'll hear from them, and we'll spotlight a couple of the posters right after this.
Sanofi seeks to break barriers for people with hemophilia through groundbreaking science so they can live beyond the limitations of their condition. Learn more about Sanofi's commitment at redefininghemophilia.com.
We're here today to talk about the poster walk inside the Bleeding Disorders Conference. Why does this exist? What's the point of it? What do some of these posters have to tell us? I'm joined by these three wonderful individuals. Mike, maybe starting with you, if we could do a quick round of introductions.
Sure. My name's Mike Recht. I'm the Chief Medical and Scientific Officer at NBDF, and I'm a pediatric hematologist who sees patients at the Yale Hemophilia Treatment Center.
And I'm Maria Santaella. I'm a pediatric nurse, but I work as a vice president of the research department of the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation.
Hi, Samantha Carlson. I am a clinical social worker. I worked primarily in adults in the clinics, but I'm the director of research at NBDF.
Well, then maybe actually if we can start, Mike, by talking about why are we here? What's the significance of these poster walls? Why is it included in something like BDC?
Sure. Thanks for that question, Patrick. So at NBDF, we are really all about innovation, and these posters really are a way for investigators to communicate what's happened over the past year, what's new, what's innovative in the inheritable bleeding disorders field, targeted to people with bleeding disorders, not necessarily targeted to scientists or clinicians.
So the patients themselves and caregivers themselves are the audience for these posters?
That's correct.
And how many posters roughly do we have here this year, would you say?
We have 50 posters.
Samantha, maybe you can answer this. How often or how many posters are generally at a poster walk like this?
It sounds like it's been spanning about 50 to 75 in the last several years.
So one of the great things about the posters in BDC is that some of the authors have their scientific posters on one side of the scientific language, but they also have on a side or on the bottom plain language summaries that actually explains the poster in a language
language summary
that everybody can understand. So
yes.
That's actually something that we encourage as a Bleeding Disorders Conference that is specifically tailored to our lived experience experts, and so that's pretty exciting when we see that in action.
Neat. That's neat.
Thank you, Maria.
And I know you're authors on some of the posters here, so there may be some biases at play. But are there anything in particular that you'd like to highlight?
There is one particular poster that I think demonstrates the power of the United States Hemophilia Treatment Center network in ensuring optimal care for inheritable bleeding disorders, so I'd like to walk over to that one and walk through it.
Let's do it.
Kevin lives with hemophilia A. He enjoys hanging out with friends, cooking, and playing guitar. But what you don't see is how living with hemophilia has impacted his communication style. Kevin bravely shares the hurdles he faced in communicating about his hemophilia with friends, family, and providers, and highlights the importance of transparent, patient-focused conversations that go beyond treating symptoms. Scan the QR code or click the link in the show notes to hear Kevin's full story and learn more about how living with hemophilia can impact communication.
All right, where's this poster we're headed to?
It is over here.
Patient-reported and clinical outcomes in people with hemophilia treated at federally sponsored hemophilia treatment centers versus non-HTC clinics, interim analysis from the CHEST US study. All right, break that down for me. What are we looking at?
So the whole idea behind this project was to investigate whether people who receive their care through the federally supported Hemophilia Treatment Center network, which is really the Bleeding Disorder Treatment Center network, end up with better outcomes than people who receive their care external to the federally supported network.
Which, of course, is a fair assumption, so to speak, but unless we have the data to back it up, then it is only an assumption, right?
Well, we don't know it's an assumption, right? We as treatment center network providers, we think our care is better.
Right.
We say our care is better, but we have to prove that, right?
Okay.
We can't just say, well, we get federal money, so we're obviously centers of excellence. That's not true.
Right.
We have to demonstrate to ourselves, to the people we serve, and to the federal government that their investment in us is worthwhile.
And do you believe that this poster and the data that it captures does that?
It's a good first step.
Okay.
So the last time we looked at this question was way back in the late 1990s, where working with the CDC, we looked at complications of people with hemophilia and the death rate with people with hemophilia. And what we saw was that people with hemophilia who received their care in the federally supported network actually had fewer complications and lived longer. The issue with that is that data has aged. And the population back in the 1990s is very different than the population of people with hemophilia now. That we were dealing with many people with HIV, right, people with hepatitis. So that really reflected the improved care of HIV and hepatitis in the treatment center. Didn't necessarily demonstrate better bleeding control care.
Right.
So now that HIV and hepatitis has become more of a chronic issue, we had to relook at this issue. And do the people who receive their care through this network have better bleeding outcomes?
Right. And overall, if I'm reading this correctly, in the HTC model, you have 58% of the people that were a part of this study with severe. Notably to me, the non-HTC severity level is still 40%. Maybe I'll ask this of you, Maria. When I see those numbers, I would expect the severity level of people in the non-HTC population to be a lot lower. I would expect more of the severes to have found their way to HTCs. Am I reading this correctly, and does it surprise you in the same way it surprises me?
Yeah, well, the most important thing about that number is that when you look at the results and you compare the results, and it looks like the HTC result, the patients in the HTC cohort are doing a little bit better. They're actually more severe, right? So that cohort, even though they're doing better within the HTC system, they're more severe than the non-HTC cohorts.
Which says a lot about the value of the HTC, right?
Correct, exactly.
Sam, can you come in here? I have a question to ask you. So when you see that number that Patrick was talking about, the fact that 40% of people receiving their care external to the HTC network have severe, can you talk about maybe some access issues?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So the first thing as a social worker that I look at for that is it disappoints me because they're missing the comprehensive care probably. So the base model of this system and the HTC network is the fact that we have physical therapy, nursing, physicians, and social workers all working together for comprehensive care for these patients. And as you can tell in the mental health tools that they used, the mental health was better when they were in an HTC network. If they're out of that network, we don't know if they have clinicians who understand their bleeding disorder that can address mental health, mobility, but moreover also access to care and the resources that they need.
Do you think we can assume that just because someone got their care external to the USHTC network that they're not getting multidisciplinary care?
Not necessarily, but I think that's a really expensive model if you're not getting support. But that's my opinion.
Yeah,
Well,
I think you're right.
I would tend to agree. And another statistic here that really strikes me, if we look at home devices used, right, so that's canes, walkers, wheelchairs, 25% of those in the HTC used something, 80% in the non-HTC, so that's a big increase. But then the next line down is particularly surprising to me. Home alterations needed, right? So that suggests that the person is particularly compromised from a mobility perspective. 3.8% for the patients treated in the HTCs, 76%, 3 out of 4 people in the non-HTC model. I mean, if that doesn't speak volumes about the value of the HTC, I don't know what does. Am I reading this one correctly?
You are. Well done.
And I'd like to go back to what Maria said, that the fact is that the people receiving their care in the HTC network have a more severe disease. So the fact that they're having the better outcome in the people that have more severe disease really addresses directly the benefit of receiving your care within the treatment center network. But the corollary is there could be some access issues for people who don't receive their care in the treatment center network.
Right.
There are certainly people who choose not to receive their care in the treatment center network, and that's great. If that's where they want to get their care, wonderful. But there are people who want to get their care in the treatment center network who can't access that.
Right.
And you want to talk about maybe why some of those reasons are?
Absolutely. So some of the areas that are rural, people could travel 8 hours round trip to try to get to an HTC, and that can be very difficult with all of the activities of daily living and life and responsibilities. I would love to see some follow-up on this of the potential benefits of doing more outreach clinics. Some of the regions are doing outreach clinics and going into rural areas to provide that care, or doing satellite, virtual or hybrid. So that might be something to explore in the future.
To that point, you mentioned earlier, Mike, this is a great step in terms of building the argument for the value of the HTC. What's the next step? What is the next step specifically for this research initiative? And then from a broader perspective, with the posters that we see here, what are generally the next steps that the folks behind the posters are taking?
So in the academic world, when you're trying to validate the results of a study you're doing or a program that you're doing, one of the things you always want to do is make sure that the population that is being studied is generalizable to the entire population that you're studying. And one of the things that's really interesting about this program is we got a lot of people external to the treatment center network. I've never seen a project with this many people.
You had more people non-HTC than
Way
HTC.
more people. So what we really need to do is potentially study more people within the HTC network to see if this really is generalized to everybody that gets their care. This is only people with hemophilia.
Yep.
So we haven't studied any other bleeding disorder. So we really want to understand what working with the HTC means if you have von Willebrand's disease or a platelet disorder or a rare coagulation disorder or even a connective tissue disorder.
And those are probably all different, separate follow-up studies, right?
Those would be all completely different follow-up studies, yes.
That makes sense.
And I think that a great follow-up to this is what's going on with the women, right? I think that when we're in all spaces like this in which we're hearing and we understand that the women are affected by bleeding disorders, sometimes in the same manner that men are affected, I don't think we're necessarily talking as well, sending that message as well to others outside of the HTC network. And it would be very important to see, how are these women being treated? Are they being diagnosed? Are they accessing care? Are they being treated as they're supposed to be treated?
That makes good sense. In fact, I saw somewhere not too far from here, at least one poster on women with bleeding disorders. Maybe we can take a little journey and find one other poster that we can take a look at, perhaps over in this direction.
Health equity starts with understanding. Sanofi's global survey of 2,700 participants across 11 countries uncovers critical care gaps for people with hemophilia. Only 30% of patients report adequate care, and just 21% discuss overall health with providers, highlighting inequities in comprehensive care. Furthermore, 59% of caregivers face significant strain, proving unmet needs go beyond patients. Addressing these disparities is essential for equity. Scan the QR code or click the link in the show notes to explore the findings and learn how Sanofi is building a more equitable future for the hemophilia community.
So we are now gathered at the females with von Willebrand disease have similar arthropathy rates to females with moderate and mild hemophilia, with hemophilia joint health score not predicted by factor levels. What does that all mean, Dr. Recht?
So this is a really important poster. What this is talking, it's important for a couple reasons. Number one, it's looking at women with bleeding disorders, a chronically underserved population within the Hemophilia Treatment Center network. It's comparing people, women with hemophilia compared to those with von Willebrand's disease. And the teaching has been, up until recently, that maybe women with hemophilia don't have bleeding, but definitely into their joints and muscles, but definitely women with von Willebrand's disease do not bleed into their muscles and joints. And this work from the Colorado Center really helps us refocus on the impact of what maybe in the past were considered mild bleeding disorders, and looks at the impact on a woman's life of having these conditions.
Well, as you said, that's extremely important. And what's the importance of using the hemophilia joint health score as a metric here?
So the hemophilia joint health score is really the only validated measure we have in the bleeding disorders community to look at the overall health of a joint. It is a very specific physical exam where each joint is measured for range of motion, for swelling, chronic changes. It is a very long test to give. For a trained physical therapist, it takes about 45 minutes. So it's a great study to use for something like this.
Maria, as you consider this poster and the topic of women with bleeding disorders in general, what most stands out to you?
You know, I just the fact that recognizing and acknowledging that there's joint bleeding in women with bleeding disorders, I think it's a huge step. And actually including them in studies in a systematic manner so that we can actually measure and demonstrate that there are deficiencies when we do joint scores in their joints. I think it's a very strong message, and the proof that we need to now, like I said, go out there to the non-HTC networks, the people who are not here in BDC, to take them seriously when they come to clinic and they said, I think I have a bleed.
Yes, absolutely. Samantha, anything you'd like to add to that?
Again, I'd love to see the quality of life follow up with this. When you think of these individuals and how they summarize it, how did this interrupt their life? How did it interrupt work and taking care of your family or enjoying your quality of life? And it would be interesting to see the mental health impact of that and how we can improve that.
Sam, can I ask you a question? How do you think something like this just helps women feel seen and heard?
That's a great question. You're welcome. With the right plain language summary and delivered in the right manner, it's going to validate a lot of people. And it's going to help people have a conversation about what their symptoms are and feel like they're taken seriously.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Maria, Sam, and thank you, Dr. Recht, for participating in this little poster walk discussion. I think a lot of times, I know I, as a patient, would see the posters and I get intimidated, and I don't necessarily know that it's for me. So I think it's valuable to hear that it's designed with the community consumer in mind, our patients and caregivers, and those plain language summaries go a long way because not everybody has the three of you to walk around and get interpretation. So thank you for doing this with me.
To that last point, I certainly came away from that poster walk with greater appreciation for how research papers, like those showcased at BDC, are in fact intended for people like me, lay people, patients, caregivers, advocates, and the use of tools like plain language summaries are designed to make research data and takeaways more accessible to the average person. These feel like critical steps toward building trust with patient audiences and fostering a spirit of collaboration around research. Dr. DiMichele, welcome to the episode. I want to ask you a couple of questions as we wrap up. Beyond patient-facing poster walls and plain language summaries, what more could be done to foster interest in research amongst patients and caregivers? How do we continue to address that known need?
Thanks for engaging me in this conversation. And as you mentioned, patient-facing posters and summaries and the kind of summaries, plain language summaries that help to explain research to patients is an important step, no doubt about it. But when you think about it, it's actually really just a first good step, and it actually still represents more passive engagement with research than active engagement. And I think that the next step is really much more active engagement. And so what does that mean? Well, what it means is that now patients or LEAs might be able to take the next step in two different ways. The first is taking research that's already been done and actually having, rather than doctor, researcher, nurse discussions with LEAs, actually have LEA-to-LEA discussions of what that research means for them on a peer level. So in other words, having patients or LEAs actually disseminate to other patients and LEAs the results of these studies and engage them in what they're hearing and how they're feeling about these results and how they apply to them, etc. I think that the second way that we can more actively engage LEAs. So, another next important step is not only involving LEAs in the dissemination of research, but actually involving them right from the get-go, from start to finish, in helping researchers at all levels prioritize what's the most important research to do. How can that study be designed in a way that would make it easier for LEAs to engage and participate? How can that study, be analyzed and interpreted in a way? I mean, are we asking the right questions? Are we using the right clinical endpoints? And once the study is done, once again, peer-to-peer dissemination of what these results might mean or not mean, or, how these results might be either interim results or, definitive results that they can use immediately, or an important step toward, final results, something like that. So I think those are the two important next steps. And to be honest with you, all the professional societies that I'm involved with, American Society of Hematology, International Society of Thrombosis and Hemostasis, are recognizing that this is an important next step. But the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation has really been, in the lead on this issue, having spent, the last 4 years developing a blueprint for how LEAs can be involved in all of these ways that I've described in, under the umbrella of what they're calling the Research Ambassador Program. So I think that next step is an important next step. And I also think that it will be realized with time. I don't believe there's any going back on that.
Great comments. And that Research Ambassador Program is certainly something that we should talk about on future episodes here of the Global Hemophilia Report. My last question, I want to look at a slightly different point of focus. This comes from comments that we heard Samantha Carlson make during the walk and talk a couple of times she referenced the need for follow-on research. I think listeners, you also heard Mike highlight the need for follow-up research with respect to the HTC versus non-HTC study. But my question for you, Dr. DiMichele, is how important is it that research builds upon itself as opposed to research that's executed, published, but then treated like a closed book? Can you speak to that?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, I can. And that is an incredibly, incredibly important question. So the issues of clinical studies and trials actually delivering definitive results, okay? The kind of results where you can say, this is what this study says, this is what it means, prophylaxis is good, immune tolerance, is successful in this percentage of patients. Those kinds of definitive results are incredibly hard to come by in the field of bleeding disorders, hemophilia and bleeding disorders. Why? Because they're rare. And because they're rare, clinical studies are small. And by that, I mean they enroll small populations by necessity. And designed in the traditional way, clinical studies and trials of small populations don't give definitive results because they rely on statistical probability. And the larger the number of individuals participating in the study, the more likely that statistical probability reflects reality, right? So this is a problem that we've had, for a long time. And it's not just hemophilia, it's in any field where populations are sparse and rare. And what happens is that there's often a study done and it'll say, oh, this wasn't a statistical result, but it looks like this is what's going on, but we need to study it further. And if you look at, the kind of studies that are published, the number that say, this is interesting, but further studies are needed are quite significant for exactly that reason. So that happens. But do the follow-on studies actually happen? No. That's where, this concept of no one-offs, just studying this once and never coming back to a non-definitive result again to either prove it or expand on it, etc. And so how do we remedy that? I think is an important question. And there probably are two ways that we can think of to sort of change this situation and to flip it around so that the research that's generated in bleeding disorders is a little more definitive. The first is educating the community of researchers in inherited bleeding disorders about how to do small clinical trials. And, the methodologies, the design of small clinical trials is different than traditional clinical trials. And not everybody knows that. And when I was at the NIH, we actually appreciated this problem and actually had a special initiative in which we offered to the bleeding disorders community to come in and use the help of experts in small clinical trial design to help design a trial. And the interesting thing is, out of that is a resource that sits at the NIH website that actually has a tremendous amount of educational materials that can continue to educate our community about how to do small clinical trials. And it's a difference in the design of the trial. It's a difference in the clinical endpoints that you can expect from a trial. And it's not uncommon for small clinical trials to have incremental results. Okay, so oftentimes you do still have to take an incremental result and take it to the next level. So the second important remedy for one-off or less definitive, clinical studies and trials is to have a network, is to have a system in place, a network in place, an organization, an infrastructure that takes a trial or takes the results of a trial and facilitates immediately the follow-on study. Takes those results and says, okay, now this trial or this study has defined some interesting results, and it's pointed the way toward how to ask the next set of questions to really get to where we want to be, right? And in a network, in a sort of coordinated way where there are resources and mentors and the facilities to design the next clinical trial with the help of Lee's and with the input of Lee's, that next trial, that next study can get done and take us to that next step. That is what the Bleeding Disorders Research Collaborative was designed to do. First, the National Research Blueprint, and now the Bleeding Disorders Research Collaborative, if it becomes a reality, is designed to bring the hemophilia community into a single space that would facilitate not only better trials because of Lee involvement and better resources to design these trials and these studies, but also the infrastructure to allow the follow-on trials and the follow-on studies to happen in a more facilitated way. It's interesting. This is not a theoretical. People speak all the time about how outcomes in childhood cancer over the last 30 years have improved incredibly. And the way they improved incredibly is through a cooperative organization in which the incremental study of multiple different childhood cancers happened. And those results then inform the next set of trials and then inform the next set of trials until, standard risk, acute lymphocytic leukemia now in childhood, we have a 96% survival. And so then the next set of incremental trials are, okay, how do we do that with maybe less toxicity? And so you start, then beginning to back off. But you can only do this when you bring a national, when you organize this nationally and bring, all the researchers, all the clinicians whose knowledge can come to bear on a problem together in one place. So it's been done. And, unfortunately, the missing link is funding. I'll leave it there.
Fair enough. Yeah. Funding is the bottom line many times, isn't it?
It is.
Well,
it is.
Then that will give me the opportunity to say I'd like to thank Mike, Sam, and Maria for joining me during a jam-packed BDC to provide their insights. And of course, I'd like to thank my partner on this podcast, Dr. Donna DiMichele, for providing hers. I'd also like to thank the team behind the scenes at Believe Limited for making this special episode of the podcast happen. And thank you to Sanofi, our featured advertiser, for making this and all episodes of the Global Hemophilia Report possible, which you can find by going to globalhemophiliareport.com or searching Global Hemophilia Report wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all the time that we have for this episode. Follow Global Hemophilia Report and Bloodstream Media on social media to see breakout content from this and other episodes, and be sure to subscribe to Global Hemophilia Report to have the next episode delivered to you the moment it goes live. I am your resident person with hemophilia and host, Patrick James Lynch, and until next time.
Sanofi is committed to bringing new perspectives and bold innovations to the global hemophilia community. Learn more about how Sanofi is committed to breaking barriers and supporting the community at redefininghemophilia.com.